Welcome, participants, from wherever you're joining us today to what I am sure is going to be a very productive and inspiring panel discussion. My name is Milton Alimadi. I am publisher of Black Star News, and I'm going to be the moderator today. I want to first start off by thanking Friends of the Congo for organizing this as part of Congo Week, which has been going on for many years now. It's an annual event which highlights and keeps the struggle for total emancipation in the Congo. It keeps it in the international limelight, as well as the same struggle in Africa. I'm very honored and pleased to have been invited to be the moderator today. So today's theme is dismantling the lingering edifices of colonialism and creating, I suppose, a new path forward. And we're very honored to have esteemed guests as part of the panel today. We have with us a person who needs no introduction, Ngugi wa THIONG'O. He's one of Africa's greatest writers and intellectuals. He's been a personal teacher to me. I started reading his books in my teenage years. He is today a distinguished professor of English and comparative literature at the University of California at Irvine, the author of many books. I cannot list all of them, but I believe the first one I read was The River Between. And all of you listening, you remember the ones you read first. A Grain of Wheat, Weep Not Child, Petals of Blood, Devil on a Cross, and one of my favorite is Decolonizing the Mind, which I think is something we need to discuss today's panel discussion as well. And also joining us today on the panel is Cherie Rivers Ndaliko, and she's Associate Professor of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And also joining us, the final panelist is Petna Ndaliko. He is the founder and executive director of the Yole Africa Cultural Center. Welcome, panelists. I welcome all of you. So let's get straight to it. I would like to turn the question and the theme a little bit around and pose it this way. Julius Nyerere, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, the late president of Tanzania, once said to an interviewer that winning political independence did not automatically translate into the end of imperialism. And the late Kwame Nkrumah, another great Pan-Africanist, wrote a book entitled Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. So to put my question bluntly to my panelists, so long as imperialism exists, can we really say that colonialism has really ended in Africa? I will start with you, Dr. Ngugi.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and the list of my books. To add to that list, I might mention my latest book, which I wrote in the Koyo language, Kedamoyuru, but now it's available in English as The Perfect Nine. And this shows it centers really the power of women. And I believe the power of women has something to do, or will have a lot to say, or to do with the dismantling the remnants of colonialism. What, if I might put in one phrase, for African continent, the independence became Africanization of the colonial inequities. And that's really the problem. Instead of uprooting the very basis of colonialism, we Africanized it. So the same inequities that were there before during colonialism are still there. The dominant, our economies being dominated by the Western European corporations, that is still there. Yeah. And if your economy, if you don't have economic independence or economic self-reliance, then politically, you become also dependent. And you become dependent politically, culturally, you also become dependent, you know. So by Africanizing the colonial inequities, we really became all the distortions, if you like, or rather the economic, political, and cultural exploitation of Africa by the West. Huh? Can you hear me? Continues. The only difference is now there's a class of Africans who now ally with that exploitation of the continent. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, can Sherry, would you like to address that same question?
So much. It's an honor to be part of this conversation. This is a really important conversation, and of course a greater honor to get to enter into this particular conversation with THIONG'O. As you shared, I too had very formative experiences in my early intellectual life by reading the books that you listed that I won't list again. And I think that you highlighted the question of decolonizing the mind, and that's where I go in response to your question. That, I mean, as you phrased it, is it possible for colonialism to really be over as long as imperialism continues? And categorically, the answer is no, right? In my opinion. And the question then for me is, what are, as you said, the lingering edifices? And so many of them are both structural in the very forms that Ngugi just listed for us, and also psychological. And you know, they go hand in hand, of course. And so I think about this as a question that certainly is relevant to the African continent, but I also think of it as a question that's relevant even more broadly than that, because the very structure that we're asked to participate in when we're talking about Africa, the whole allegiance to national boundaries, for instance, the whole political structure is you know, the result of the imperial and colonial projects. And so I think of the question as being much bigger than just the physical outline of the continent. And I hope we, in this conversation, we get to the bit about what we can do to dismantle these edifices. So I don't want to belabor the point. I think it was just made beautifully that we have, many of us, consciously or unconsciously, we participate in the structures of the colonial inheritance. And as long as the priorities globally are determined by the economic metrics that were imposed through imperialism and the social and political metrics that were imposed, then we're still effectively in a colonized and colonial condition.
Those who come from, especially the former settler colonies, like say Kenya, South Africa, will know that colonialism had a racial character. Think of the pyramid, the structure of the pyramid with white at the top, generally in a case like Kenya, Asians in the middle, and Africans at the bottom. That was the economic, political, and cultural pyramid. Now, what then we did at independence was a removal, if you like, of the racial barrier to moving up and down the pyramid, but the pyramid structure remained the same, meaning at the top of the pyramid, only a few people could occupy that space. But unfortunately for us also, that pyramid was connected to a bigger pyramid
Right.
in Europe.
Yes.
So think of two pyramids. The big one in the West, again, the same structure with our pyramid subservient to the European pyramid, right? And this is what we have to, if we have to think about dismantling colonialism, we have to think of that pyramid structure of our society. But in our case, also additionally, how to delink our pyramid from the big pyramid in the West, okay? But within us, we have to really turn the pyramid structure of us upside down, because the real power of Africa is really the ordinary man and woman, or say the working people of Africa. And we know this is true because whether it's the Congo or Kenya or South Africa, our independence, we won our independence, whatever it was, on the backs of the support of ordinary men and women. It's not that we had more guns or more firepower than our colonial masters, but what we had was one thing: a general unity of purpose between the nationalist elite, if you like, and the population as a whole. Recently, you remember those in South Africa, for instance, during Mandela, when in Robben Island, how just the sheer sight of people in South Africa marching in the streets, singing a mandala and so on, that alone moved you no matter where you are. That power was there in the Congo during Mulumba's time, was there in Ghana in Nkrumah's time, was also there in Kenya. And then at the independence, somehow or other, it came to our mind, especially the elite, that somehow or other, the Europe, which for 60, 100 years did not do anything about economic equality, would now be our friends. They would be helping us to do what they could not do for 60, 100 years. Right? It's like asking a thief to somehow help you rid of thievery. I don't know. Right?
No, very well put.
And trusting that they are going to do so. Right.
It's very well put. I would like to, maybe Pednat, if you could pick up the argument from where Professor Ngugi has led us, because he has raised a few issues. The fact that Africa has been sort of brought into the international global system in a very peripheral and dependent condition. And now what we have post the colonial era are the new African elite essentially serving the interest of the former colonizers. So how do we empower the ordinary Africans on the streets, whether it's Congo, whether it's Ghana, whether it's Nigeria, where we are now seeing young men on the streets, whether it's Uganda. So could you pick it up from there, please?
Yeah. Again, as all of you mentioned, I would like also to recognize the immense pleasure to be seated here. Just first of all, seeing Professor Ngugi THIONG'O again and sit on the panel with him, that's amazing. With how all his thinking did influence my own approach to life and thinking today. So thank you to be with you. And thank you again for Friends of Congo for thinking of organizing a panel like this one. And I'm very much more interested also with this question of how the whole colonial mindset and the whole just project, how it was set to be, and that we, the people, can be where we are now with it. But beyond that, my main interest is the pre-colonial, like how the pre-colonial can be a beginning of a kind of a new thinking to move forward to create something new that, of course, which will recognize that we pass through the colonial period. Because I have the impression that the discussion most of the time only takes it from the colonial era and then the post-colonial without giving much space to the pre-colonial.
Yes.
Because and without trying to be nostalgic or saying people should go back in the past, but use that heritage, which we know that it was functioning very well without the colonial, participation in it.
Right.
Like create, like a new metaphors, new aesthetic, or I will say also new fantasy of which we can move forward with. That's where, for me, where I am. I think, as understanding, the actual period is important.
Right.
I think it's also very important most of the time to go pre-colonial as we're moving forward.
Pedna, I appreciate that interjection. In fact, that was one of the questions that I meant to ask. So I appreciate that you brought it up, because I think the late Anta Diop reminded us very effectively in African Origin of Civilization that, in fact, most of the things that Europe is now being praised for originated in Africa, including the intellectual thought. So I think it's important that our youth need to know that. So then let me rephrase my question to you. Because I think, as Professor Ngugi listed, the racist hierarchy of the Europeans and then the Asians and the African, I think it also instilled a sense of inferiority complex. So how do we actually get our youth to believe that, in fact, many of these ideas belong to us as Africans, and thereby open up their imagination into how we can create a new Africa? Could you take on that question? And then Sherry, could you handle the same question too?
Yes, we have put, I don't know if you want to take it first. What we are working on now, it is a curriculum called Decomposing the Colonial Gaze. And the idea, it is to start from the beginning, where the way of how we see, the way we look at the world the way it is today. And then from that, the same frame, which is like it's literally, it's a frame. Because if you start looking at the world at a 360 degree, then you will understand that most of the thing that we study or we believe in, the system even of government, like today, we only stick on democracy, believing that that is the only way of going. Yet there has been so many other forms of governing a community or society, right? And with this, the idea, it is to go as far as when did we start to believe in the system of normalized violence, and take it to other possibilities which exist, or just put it in short, to be able to reactivate the possibility of people imagining other ways of living. I think you can carry on.
I can say more. Yes.
Okay. And by the way, don't limit your response to directly to the question posed. Allow yourself to be creative with your responses.
Thank you. So that's a good reminder for me. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
To just sort of pick up, I guess, where Petna left off, I want to make 2 points, really. One has to do with this curriculum that we've developed called Decomposing the Colonial Gaze, that, as he just indicated, has everything to do with becoming aware of how we have been conditioned to perceive things according to a certain system of values that are not innate, that are not inherent, and yet we often subscribe to them without questioning whether there are other ways of perceiving. And in this, there's a beautiful quote from Toni Morrison that is a sort of guiding idea in the work that we do on decomposing, which says, this is again Toni Morrison from Beloved, she says, "Disremembered and unaccounted for, she could not be lost because no one was looking for her." And this idea of that which has been disremembered, that which is lost because we aren't looking, we aren't thinking to look. And I hear that in what you were saying about looking to the pre-colonial, not in a nostalgic way, not in a fantasy way. We've all read Fanon, we like that. That's not the reference, but to understand that if we start our point of departure for this project in a colonial moment, we are disremembering and not accounting for so many other things that give us a really different perception of the world. And I find it really beautiful. The other piece that we work so much with, in addition to Toni Morrison's idea of disremembering, is of course what THIONG'O has written in Something Torn and New about remembering, right? Like what is it to remember that which has been not just dismembered, but also disremembered. So there's so much in that, and it even goes to the heart of your question. I was listening to thinking about it as you were asking, how do we get the youth to value these things, to understand that those ideas were initially ours in the first place? And I even hesitate with that, because why do we have to fight over what the European value is, the Western value is, right? Why don't we just look to what we already have? And in the most practical sense, as we embody it, it's little things like farming, like we can grow our own food, right? And small actions like that go straight to this point of actual economic independence, that go straight to the point of autonomy, that are tangible practices. You can plant a seed and you can tend it and you can watch it grow and it can nourish you, and the whole thought process that goes along with that. There's so much embedded in that, and there's so many practices that just have to do with cultivating food, for instance, that really do that speak directly to this in practice. So it's not purely a theoretical exercise. So I guess the summary of what I'm saying is that in our approach anyway is to work with the ideas and the history, and to learning to seeing in that history what has been actively disremembered, and then in remembering it is through the daily actions that we take that quite literally remove us from reliance on the very systems that continue to keep, to enforce colonial subservience.
Very well put. Professor Ngugi, would you like to continue?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you mentioned my book, Something Torn and New. Actually, in East Africa, it's been published under the title Remembering Africa. Using the remembering in the two senses of putting it all together, like you remember, something which has been torn apart, you remember it,
right?
The memory of remembering.
Yes.
And the book is really essential about the politics of memory, because the colonialism really is, in some ways, apart from economic and political, additionally, is a question of replacing memory of place, memory of history, memories of our bodies, with a European memory of place and way of looking at the world. Yeah. So that's why I talk about remembering. And you can see it in all colonial places, the replacement of languages, the replacement of naming systems.
Yes.
Which include language, names, our bodies, how even we talk about our history, our environment, and so on. That's why I called for remembering the continent in the two senses, of the word, remember. But if we're talking about pre-colonial, and I believe we should draw from, those pre-colonial. And this doesn't mean that everything pre-colonial was perfect.
Right.
No. But at the same time, we have to learn from that history. We have to learn that ancient Egyptian history is our history.
Absolutely.
There's no reason why we think Greek history is more of our original history than Egyptian. And where the Greek history or knowledge, after all, was also drawn from. The Greeks, they drew from Egyptian knowledges at the time. Right? And remember, Egyptian history, civilization lasted 3,000 years at least.
Yes.
Right? Which is still 1,000 years longer than the current Western civilization that dates from, say, birth of Christ or whatever.
Absolutely.
Right? So that history, with all its glory and with all its positive and negative, is our story, and we must embrace it. We must embrace the history of those who built Zimbabwe for reasons, or all the city civilizations along the East African coast that were even mentioned once by Milton in Paradise Lost.
Right.
Where Angel Gabriel or Michael, I don't remember when Adam and Eve, in quotes, are expelled from paradise, they are taken by the angel to show them the future civilizations of the future. And Malindi and Mombasa and Mogadishu and all those are mentioned. Yeah. So we have to reconnect with that memory, not to return to that, but the spirit of it is very, very, very important. Now,
very good.
One of the things we have to remember is this. One fact of pre-colonial is a question of language. Right? Egyptian civilization of 3,000 years was not built on English, French, or Portuguese. Right? They never spoke a word of European languages.
Right.
And I'm not saying that European languages are bad or anything else. I'm just saying that this was the assumption that European languages are inherently better vehicles of knowledge, and so it's nonsense. Because all the architecture, all the everything, sciences, the mathematics, that were, initially in Egypt, were not initiated in European languages. Okay, yeah. So one fact which is we cannot contest is the question that in pre-colonial Africa, African languages were the norm, okay? And they're still important because there's no way we are going to harness the power of the people of Africa unless we are able to communicate with them in the languages they speak and use, okay? You can't say that you care about your grandmother, about her, you're a doctor and you care about your grandmother, and when you go back to treat her, you cannot speak to her, right? You cannot tell her what is the problem with her because you two cannot really communicate unless you get an interpreter.
Right.
Okay? Right. So African languages are still there, but we have to find a way of reconnecting with those languages. Not because speaking African languages in themselves solve the problem, but as vehicles of communication and carriers of memory, they connect African people, right? Now, you cannot say you care about the people and then you don't want to speak to them, or you can speak to them only when they learn European languages, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me just sum up how I think about languages, because I like to use this sentence. Europe, if you like, at the most generous level, gave us, the resources of their accents, okay? And we gave Europe access to the resources of the continent, yeah. So we exchange accents for access. And unless we solve that problem, Africa, we're not going to decolonize. Yeah. Access to the resources of the continent for Europe, and we are good at perfecting the resources of their accents. How to speak English correctly,
Yes.
how to do French this, I mean, this, claiming that French is really ours, English is really our languages, and so on.
Yes.
But Europe has access to the copper, the mining of gold, oil in Nigeria, and zinc wherever. The Congo is a good example of this. If I look from the Congo, might correct me here, but I believe the Congo alone has all the minerals that are used in virtually anything, the economies of the West, including nuclear weapons, and everything the Congo has. But who controls those resources?
Right.
Who controls the zinc, the copper, the gold, the uranium, cobalt in the Congo today?
Not the Congolese.
Yeah, definitely not the Congolese who do it. At least I've not been there, but I would assume it's not the Congolese who do that, okay? And that's the story of Africa. In Nigeria, who controls I'm told that Nigerian oil is one of the best in the world, right? It is used to refine other oils, okay? So it's the oil of oils. Who controls that oil? And the results that come from that oil, And the same story in Tanzania, diamond. There have been diamonds in Tanzania long, even before, during the colonial, and now, where the diamond-based industries are in Tanzania, South Africa, gold, everything possible is still in South Africa. So who controls all that? Even financial institutions, the banking system in the continent, who control the banking systems in Africa today? I'm not talking about yesterday, today. If you go to Lagos or to Nairobi, when you look at the names of the banks, who owns the banking system?
Right.
All the financial capitalism. Who controls that financial capitalism in Africa? Again, the same story over the continent. By example, let's do it the other way around. Even under capitalism, if you go to London, and I've been asking people this, you go to London, how many African-owned corporations are registered in London or in New York? How many African-owned oil companies are drilling oil in England, in America, in Belgium, or other places? Even, and it's reflected in other things. We have foreign joint military exercises between Europe and Africa, for instance. How those joint military exercises are always done on African soil.
Right.
I've never heard of a single joint military exercise between French and African troops in France, or in England, Kenya, and in England and so on.
Right.
I'm not saying we have them, but I'm showing how all these things are really connected.
Right.
And I come back to what we were saying before. Until the question of pre-colonial Africa is that at the very least, people controlled their resources.
Right.
they were in control of the land.
Yes.
They were in control of what it produced. You know, we can argue about the distribution of those resources. That's a different question. You know, but largely it was controlled by people themselves. People were self-reliant. You know, she talked about planting, and that was, to me, that's a very, very strong image.
Yes, it is.
Because it's an image of self-reliance. Self-reliance, you know, that's the key to dismantling colonialism or remnants of colonialism in Africa. Self-reliance. And then on the basis of self-reliance, we can connect to other economies and others on basis of equal give and equal take.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just now, it's completely lopsided.
Right.
But one thing else I might want to mention here in terms of just mental attitude. Colonialism, in essence, was a system of robbery. Literally.
Yes.
It was European class and literally robbing the continent. Okay? So corruption was inherent in the colonial system.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, in many African countries right now, let's face it, the elite have Africanized corruption. Okay? So the system of robbing, we Africanize it. Yeah. It's like we, the elite in Africa, now stealing from our parents.
Absolutely.
How do you think if you found a man, say, in this case, let's just use the patriarchy, a man, you know, meeting other men, bragging about, oh, you know, last night I broke into my wife's place and stole their clothes and my children's clothes, you know, and look at how many, look at the glitter which I stole from my wife and children.
Right.
But really, if you think of the country as a whole, this is exactly what the elite in Africa are doing.
Right.
Stealing from the continent and then banking that money in Western bank institutions. So when you go and borrow money from the West, we are later borrowing the same money which we return to the continent. Yeah, right?
Absolutely.
So we help the African elite and governments continue helping in the underdevelopment of the continent. You know, we borrow money, whatever it is, you know, is our money. Then we steal it. We take it back to the banks. Then we go, and so we are always borrowing from our own money, and then we pay interest and debt servicing on money which was ours, which is lent to us. So it's continuous absurdity.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it's a very absurd situation in which we find ourselves.
Yes.
And we have to say this: African elite and African governments are part of that system of robbery.
Yes.
Okay? And until our governments say, this is our continent, this is our Nigeria, this is our Kenya, and so on, until they take that sense of ownership, if they continue becoming robbers of their mothers and children to go and bank that money to the main robbers from Europe, we shall continue to be underdeveloped, and we're not going to dismantle colonialism.
Yes, I agree. Right. In addition to borrowing from the money stolen by the elite, borrowing from money stolen by the former colonial powers as well.
Yeah.
So Sherry, I would like to pick up on a point you made, and obviously you can also address some of the points that have been raised by Professor Ngugi, in addition to the aspect of language as being a possible empowering tool that we can use in Africa. But I wanted to go back to you mentioned of the metaphor of the seed. And we saw what happened in Burkina Faso, for example. So I use that as an example, where Thomas Sankara comes there in '83, and he revolutionizes the way that the Burkinabe think. In fact, he starts off by changing the name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of the upright people, to inspire the imagination into what they can truly achieve. And then within 3 years, they become food sufficient. within his lifetime, they built their own railway, rolling up their sleeves and contributing. They built health clinics all over the country. They start taking agency of their lives by building plants to stop desertification. But then we saw that Sankara ultimately paid the ultimate price because the former colonial powers don't like these kind of examples. And in fact, he predicted his death when he attended the Organization of African Unity meeting in 1987. And he urged the other leaders, let's renounce the debt collectively, because if I do it alone as Sankara, I won't be alive to attend next year's conference. And within 3 months, he was dead. So my question is, can African individual leaders take these kind of stance individually, or must they do it collectively, which goes back to the need for African unity? Because we also saw what happened to Kwame Nkrumah when he was preaching Pan-African unity, using Africa's minerals to industrialize. He was overthrown. Lumumba, he was assassinated very brutally. So that is the question. Can they really, because it seems like we know some of these solutions, but if they're done individually, they don't seem to stand much of a chance.
And by the way, don't forget Gaddafi.
Yes, actually, I wanted to bring that later on. In fact, I wanted to put it this way.
Okay.
I may as well pose it now. In the way NATO invaded and overthrew Gaddafi and destroyed Libya, and Africa, I think it proved Africa's impotence, that Africa could not do anything about it in the same way in which Africa could not do anything when Congo was destroyed in 1960. So I guess we could combine all these elements together now. So let's start with you, Sherry. We'll go to Pedna, and then we'll come back to Professor Ngugi.
So thank you. It's such an important question. And I would start actually from a different angle.
Absolutely.
By evoking what we've talked about in the past already in this conversation in relation to the pre-colonial history. And one thing that I've learned from studying this history is about other forms of social organization that aren't hierarchical, where we don't have an individual on the top who, once eliminated, leaves room for, you know, there's no longer any vision, there's no longer any organization. And if we look at all of the matriarchal and matrilineal societies where there's a horizontal, circular kind of a leadership structure as opposed to a hierarchy, you can see that the success or failure does not hinge on one individual person. So personally, in my way of thinking about how to actually solve this problem, it has to do with how we even configure leadership in the first place. Yes, it absolutely has to be collective, and continental, and there has to be inter African cooperation and participation. I even hesitate to say international because, again, as I pointed out early, the national heritage is just a colonial noose, right?
Yes,
The idea that we're supposed to function as nation states is utterly absurd, right? And when we accept that we have to function as nation states, then we have to have national economies, and then we get into the same absurd cycle that we were just hearing about. So when I think about the question of how do you actually make sustainable large-scale change, it has to be a complete reimagination. And you were talking a moment ago about inspiring imagination. And I think that has to go much farther than imagining different ways of working within the absurd structures that the system is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. And as long as we keep trying to improve it, we are complicit in executing it the way that it's designed to function. There's a beautiful image that the author Daniel Quinn puts forward of a person or a society of people who, without consulting the laws of aerodynamics, decide to make a flying machine, and they push themselves off a cliff in their flying machine that is not aerodynamically satisfactory, and they call it flying because they haven't crashed yet. Right? And as they're careening towards the earth, they're saying, well, maybe if we add a wing here, or we pedal harder over there, or like throw off the extra baggage. But it's functioning according to the laws of gravity. And when we look at the pyramid, the racial hierarchy, racial capitalism, all of it, we can try to make it better using its tools, but it is functioning the way that it's meant to function. So my actual answer to you is a complete reimagination, not just of how we can operate within the system that has been imposed, but what are the other systems? And then, you know, that again is where we look to what other languages of imagination do we have? What other ways of organizing ourselves collectively could we use? Because if we can have a collective that isn't reliant on elites, that isn't reliant on this sort of leadership, you know, the single person in power, then we can change so many more things. And I'm not talking about this in a sort of utopic, we're going to solve the problems, you know, immediately. But to me, the effort that, or at least the effort that I put towards the long scale change is about like building communities that are not reliant on a single charismatic or you know, dominant figure who can be either corrupted or assassinated or whatever else, and then the whole vision falls apart.
Correct. And Pedna, would you
Yes.
like to
So interesting. You know, I will just second Sherry by just going to the concrete thing. There is this fact that when we talk about pre-colonial, the tendency it's always trying to go to, of course, you know, to great Egypt, and we were great, we were kings, we were queens, and sometimes we forget to look at what is near us. You know, I've been always interested by the question of saying why there is a serious problem of a community on a continent, which, you know, they have come to call tribes, right? The people. And there is so many solutions within those communities. We don't even need to go back to Egypt or to go back to all of us to say that we were Egyptian. We don't even need to go there, you know, even if it's a fact.
Right.
There is you know, I grew up knowing that that it wasn't good for me to be proud to be Nande, you know, my community. Just and that question was so interesting for me to understand, right? And slowly I see why whenever things don't work within the continent, people retract themselves back to their communities.
Right.
So if these communities are functioning, why can't we build from what is already working?
Yes.
And if you look at a larger picture, you will see that many of those communities, in fact, were not colonized. And those are becoming the most dangerous community today in today's Africa, because the so-called elites, or whatever you're calling, the one they pull string, they don't have strings which they can use to control those communities. You know, I'm talking about the Nandi people. I came to read recently, like I was doing research, like the Nandi people, the Belgium managed to enter to the Nandi territory only in 1930, right? And then in 60, there was independence. So if you look at the economic structure of the Nandi people, you will be surprised how it works. Like it is very well organized, and people know how to solve, like, you know, community problem. But it's only becoming a problem when the outside comes in. But what if a social contract, which we can all agree, it is just that's like the same question of Congo. Here I'm going in a concrete from, you know, like what Dr. Ndaliko was talking about, like the question of Congo. As much as patriotic I am, as much as I want to become Congolese, but that question has never been put on the table and say, hey, are we just the product of King Leopold?
Right.
Or we have to find a way of start thinking of how to rethink, to make this Congo identity that we receive in the very crucial situation, you know, that how does that story make us to become one people? And then what are our values as a people? What are the same values we have? And we expect that a country like Congo today will function and will work well. You put a president, they will repeat the same mistake the other one will do. And this goes for so many African countries. Because the idea of saying, wait a minute, now we are together. How do we build now this as a country instead of just being a nostalgia of a colonial wild dream?
Right. Which in fact is going to lead me to my next question. But let me first read a question that came in from somebody in the audience and see if you can find a way to integrate it into your responses, all of you. And it's from Tongele. Here is a fact and also a challenge. Ordinary people in villages, towns, and cities in Africa are overtaken by the day-to-day survival struggle for food. And because they are consumed by this survival struggle, they are not aware of their capacities and abilities to creatively imagine new solutions to their problems. And thus, they rely on their political leaders who are useless. How can we reach ordinary people in villages, towns, and cities in Africa to wake up, strive to harness their own willpower, to self-transform and reprogram their mindset to imagine creative solutions to their local problems by themselves, using their local means? It is the mindset that must change, but no one will help Africans to change their mindset, but Africans themselves. That is our challenge. African leaders are at the top of the pyramid and are not interested in helping ordinary people change mindset and become creative. So our challenge is to reach ordinary people in villages, towns, and cities. But the question is how? So Professor Ngugi, if you can integrate this in anything else that you are prepared to say already in your response.
Okay. Let me first of all, we come back to the question of languages. The one thing you and I are clear about, there's no way you're going to reach anybody, ordinary person, unless you or I can speak the language of the community. There are no two ways about it, okay? Yeah. So no matter how we do it, no matter how we go about it, the question of languages is very important. And by this, I don't mean that we must have only one language in any country. Even many languages, that we start with the proposition that the languages people in that community speak must be the language in which we communicate with them about anything, right? We cannot bypass that fact,
right?
Okay, and say they must first of all learn either one African language, or learn English or French and so on.
Correct.
And I'm not saying, I want to be very clear about, I'm not saying we cannot use these other languages. Like now, you and I are communicating in English.
Yes.
But it could as easily have been communicating in French if all of us knew it.
Right.
Or we could as easily have been communicating in Kiswahili.
Absolutely.
Or in Zulu. There's nothing in English or French which makes it more inherently able to make us communicate than, say, Kiswahili.
Correct.
It's just a fact of history, colonial history has meant that you and I can speak English or French and Portuguese and so on. Right. But it's not inevitable. So no matter how we do it, no matter the difficulties, no matter whatever it is, we really have to address the question of how do you and I speak to even the community I come from. How do I, as a Gikuyu language speaker, help Gikuyu people understand what the discoverer Alimandi has discovered, the explorer, and is, in other words, how it's my responsibility to make Fanon be understood in Gikuyu, in Nkrumah be understood in Gikuyu. The same for any other who come from Zulu speakers or Yoruba speakers. And so we cannot say that responsibility belongs to other people or to the future and so on. It's a question of here and now.
Correct.
Okay? If we're going to talk about unity, we must be able to speak to, write to, or do anything we can to communicate with people in the language they speak. Right. Not the language we wish they could speak, but the languages they actually speak today.
Right.
And then work out how do we make those languages communicate with each other? Okay, that's the only way we shall harness the power of African people, right? But we cannot harness that power. Oh, I meant to mention, now that we're Fanon, please remember the last chapter in Fanon, where he really, I take that very seriously. He says, if you want to create an Africa which is the mirror image of the West,
right,
then why don't you leave the destiny of Africa to Europeans, because they can do it better?
absolutely,
right? You know, but he was saying, let's imagine another image of Africa, right? But we cannot say, oh, we want Africa to be like Europe. But that Europe is the one which did slavery on the continent, did colonialism on the continent, and now debt slavery on the continent. And you were saying, we want to copy them. We want to be like them, and so on. No, we want to be like our own people, in control of their land, of what comes from that land, in control of their own bodies, their own languages, and their own relationship to other peoples of the world, right?
Right.
Yes. So that we come, this I'm speaking to the elite of Africa, whoever is listening to us, whatever you are, you have a responsibility to the language of the community you come from. And you can't hide under the umbrella, oh, it's going to bring about tribalism, it's going to bring about this. But that is the language the people of that community speak.
Right.
Right. So let's not hide under this umbrella. Oh, tribalism is going to do all this. If we speak English, it's going to bring Africa together. If we speak in their own languages, it's going to split Africa, right? In other words, we become ourselves, somehow or other, that's going to divide Africa.
Right, right.
Division. Let's meet the challenges of many languages. Let's say you speak Zulu and I see Yoruba. That's fine. Then let us look at the challenges of how we can make Zulu and Yoruba communicate as languages by whatever means, right? But let's not avoid the real responsibility, which you, whoever is listening to me right now, as an educated person, you have a responsibility. And the first step is something which you can do. Language is something you can do something about. You know, you don't have to wait for your leader to come with educational policies so that you can start with the elite of Africa, can start by connecting with our languages, getting even the best from Europe in terms of whatever has been written about, in terms of idea, or whatever it is best, you know, and bring, or from Asia, or from other African countries, and bring it into our languages. That's how we empower people with ideas and so on. So we don't have to wait for a revolution to come.
Right.
We have to be part of that revolution to come. Yeah.
Very good. Yes. So either Cherry or Petna, do you like to continue on that theme, or should I move on to the next question?
I think we should move on to the next one.
Okay. So the question, the next question has already been implied and raised in your multiple responses to previous questions, which is to reimagine governments and governance in Africa. The late President Nyerere once said something interesting to an interviewer. He said the world would be a much better place if the United States had an opposition party. And the interviewer asked him, he said, what do you mean? There's the Republicans and the Democrats. Nyerere said, that's the problem. He said, they're both capitalists and they're both imperialists. There's no opposition party in the United States. But we can flip that question around too, to Africa, where we have formal opposition parties. But often it means they're in opposition just because they're not in government. So that's what opposition means in Africa. They don't present really authentic, different programs. They don't reimagine how governance should be in Africa. I mean, the Westminster model or some hybrid of that is seen as the only form of government. So the appeal they're making is, if you elect us into power, we are going to do a better job than the folks who are running the country now. Maybe we'll be less corrupt, maybe we will distribute resources a bit better, but they're not really presenting any fundamental change to address many of the issues that confront us. Where do we start? How do we address this issue? How do we empower the working people in Africa, for example? I mean, can we even list any prominent parties in Africa that represent purely the interest of the working people? So answer this question any way you want. Let's start with you, Sherry, and then Pedna, and then we'll come back to Professor Ngugi.
Oh, I've lost my vision. Hello?
Oh, we can hear you though.
We can hear
Yeah,
you.
I want to put how do I get my video back?
Okay, so you can't see me. We can hear you. I hope we have a technical person, and I hope he'll address that. I'll communicate with him.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so let's continue, but I'll get him to try to fix it. Go ahead, Sherry.
I think that Professor Ngugi just gave us a really beautiful answer to this question in his remarks about using things like tribalism as an excuse, because I think the whole point that all three of us are making is that, again, when you buy into the notion that government should look like it does in the West, then you can have, two slightly different variants, but as you just pointed out, there's no substantive difference. But if we even take how do we choose to define the term governance, right? And this again goes so beautifully to the point about languages. There are words to describe other forms of social organization, but as soon as we even start using the language of government, and then we're back to the language of nation, we've already sort of lost the opportunity to be thinking about it in an entirely different way. Right. And so to me, and I think this fits in just hand in hand with what Professor Ngugi was just saying, that we have the vocabularies, we just don't apply them to these things because we've been told, oh, this is what government is, and so we are, participating in the big farce that is, as I said before, working exactly as it is designed to function. So that's what I have to say about that. And I think, this goes back, this is not directly related to your immediate question, but a little bit on the question before it, that even the conception of need or capacity is often framed in colonial terms.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Just as we think about, well, how could people possibly be, engaged in imagination if they're trying to meet their basic needs? What makes those things mutually exclusive? If we look at the sort of dominant model of human need as made visual by Maslow and the pyramid, we're told to believe that need is a hierarchical thing, and that we have certain needs that are more important or immediate than others. And there are other models even of understanding what human need is, right? So one of the ones that we work with is from the Chilean economist Manfred Max Neef, whose theory on human scale development, is that there are 9 fundamental needs that are not hierarchical, and that they're universal to people across time and space. And then that there are also satisfiers to those needs that are culturally and historically specific. So we don't all satisfy the same needs in the same way, but we have the same fundamental needs. And in his theory, he has things like participation and creation and freedom as fundamental needs, in addition to subsistence and the things that one finds at the base of Maslow's pyramid. And if we think about, if we can take a holistic view like that to this question, suddenly we open up so many different possibilities. Where is the place of, creativity in the act of subsistence, for instance, right? So if we think about food as something that we buy from a store, then a lot of people don't have enough of it. But if we think
Right.
about food as something that we can grow ourselves, then we have a completely different capacity to imagine. And that, to me, is exactly the kind of imagination I'm talking about, right? It doesn't have to be some sort of fantasy, fantastical thing, but if we can unlink our imagination, liberate our imagination from all of these crazy ideas that we're taught to believe under the system of racial capitalism, then a whole other menu of options appears. And yeah, I'll stop there.
And is that some of the things you address in the curriculum you're working on?
Yes.
Okay, very good. And I hope it becomes widely available in book form, perhaps.
There is a book version of it coming soon. That was the most recent book that I've written, and we actually teach it on an ongoing basis as well.
Okay, so Pedna, would you like to add on to that same issue?
I think I will circle back after Professor Ngugi.
Okay, I think they're still trying to fix his connection. So maybe we can move on to. Oh, you can hear us.
Yes.
We can't see him, but they're trying to fix the video part. So why don't we deal with Professor Ngugi? You mentioned this earlier in passing, the role of women, and how the opportunities for women have been historically limited, not only during the colonial regime, but in the post-colonial era in Africa. So why don't you talk about that for a while, and then we'll come back to address the same question with Sherry and Pedna.
Women, patriarchy. When we look at pre-colonial Africa, the one thing we can learn from that also is the question of patriarchy was quite entrenched in many parts of the continent. And patriarchy, in a sense, does not take into account the real power of African women. If you look at our struggle for independence in Kenya, women were everywhere. When most of the men were put in concentration camps, the women were the ones who kept homes alive. When guerrilla fighters, both men and women, were fighting in the mountains, it's the women in the villages who provided them with food, with support systems. So women in Kenya, during our struggle against the British colonialism, were in the mountains fighting. They were in the villages, keeping villages alive. They were some were in prison, in concentration camps. They were everywhere, right? But when we celebrate that history, women are hardly ever mentioned. The heroes who are mentioned are the men.
Yes.
So when we look at our history, we must also really celebrate the role of women in our histories, both pre-colonial and also during our colonial struggles, and even today. And by the way, that's why, in particular, this came to me even more clearly when I wrote my book, the new epic called The Perfect Nine, in which I center women, because historically that was the case among the Gikuyu people. The original founders of the Gikuyu people, the matriarchs, were actually women. So we have to find a way of harnessing that power, learning from it, and so on. And we must start really by addressing the question of patriarchy in Africa as well. Patriarchy, pre-colonial patriarchy, was made worse by the colonial system, which helped entrench patriarchy as a way of looking at our abilities and so on. So the power of women is absolutely crucial to the liberation of the continent. They were crucial during our anti-colonial struggles. They are even more crucial today. And by that, I mean, by women, I mean also mean the ordinary woman in the continent, the farmer who goes to a little garden every single day, you know, the work in the factory and so on. This is what I mean. But women power as a whole is very, very important in the continent.
Okay. All right. Sherry, would you like to pick up on that? Are you on mute? We can't hear you, Sherry.
Thank you. I was saying I have just a tiny piece to add.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you want to?
Yeah.
Okay. You go first?
Yes.
Okay.
And remember, don't limit your response, as I suggested earlier.
So the piece that I want to add goes back to a point that I made earlier about other forms of social organization. And if we look historically at matriarchal societies, they are an example of non-hierarchical structures. Not exclusively, but by and large, matriarchal societies have a more collective leadership. And I think that's absolutely key to everything, to you know, any effort to dismantle the lingering effects of colonialism. We have to have a different form of leadership, and it can't be the hierarchical version that we get when we subscribe to all of any of the priorities of colonial logic, including patriarchy, which of course was imposed very effectively because where patriarchy could be imposed, then control was easier to gain over groups of people, right? If you can elevate a leading figure to the top, and then you can control that leading figure, and you can cultivate a class of elites beneath that leading figure who have vested interest in maintaining a little bit more power than everybody else, then that becomes a very easily controllable society, right? But the historically speaking, colonizers had the hardest time gaining control over matriarchal territories because there wasn't a person on the top to corrupt, and it was therefore not easy to create a class of elites who would have greater allegiance to the system, the hierarchy of power, right? So when I think about the role of women and the power of women, I think both in the present in relation to everything that Professor Ngugi was just talking about in terms of the ordinary women who are making the food, who are you know, raising the children, who are instilling values, who are teaching them their languages, all of these things, right? I think about the ordinary women, but I also think about the social organization, the possibilities for social organization that we can explore when we look at matriarchal societies as a model.
Yeah. Yes. I was just, you know, like going back in exploring and looking very deep into what we have already as possibilities within our own communities. You know, I believe there is a lot really we can learn without all of us being pharaoh. You know, we can really learn a lot from, you know, being the Alur people, being the Kakwa people, being, you know, Serer people, you know, Gikuyu people. Recently, as I was doing again my research about the Nande people, I came to the fact of understanding that the first gesture of colonial when they took over, the colonialists, it was to tell people not to call God in their own language. We go back again to the very beautiful way how Professor Ngugi presented the whole thing. You know, and because the God in a Nande culture, she's referred to as Nyamuhanga. And Nya, it's a prefix for a woman, which is the mother of everything, right? Nyamuhanga. So if already, like in a cosmology of Nande people, you have the core, like you know, the great spirit. The great spirit was the mother of everything. So and then men to become king in the same society or Mwami, traditional chief, they had to go through a certain training. But women, It were just a social status that you can get. They call you Mugole. The Mugole culture, which in Uganda, when you go there, you will have the Bagole culture, you know, like, for me, I just feel like we can look just within where we are without, again, this colonial gaze, without the colonial binocular. We have all the answers there around us.
We just have to put our resources together. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And you know, I insist on the fact of a rethinking of this social, you know, the social, I just said a word and then it just got in my head. Contract, whereby we will start like thinking of what unites us so that we can carry on. Even the question of a Yoruba speaking Serer won't even happen, because there will be a why we are sitting together on the same table and build. And I think when we think about the question of women, already for me, asking that question, it's already like violating the right of the pillar of a society, which is a woman.
Well put.
Yeah, because yeah.
Okay, so we have about 40 minutes left. Perhaps we can provide some resources for people that are listening to us. So I would like to pose questions such as, for example, we see how in many African countries, the state is very repressive, particularly when it comes toward creative thinkers, when it comes towards writers, when it comes to independent journalists. And there's also a lack of funding for creative artists. I mean, to make a living in writing in many African countries. But I would like for you to address, each of you, the role of the artist, the role of the creative writer in Africa, and how they can perhaps try to teach the youth, to teach working people, and communicate the vision or image of the new Africa that we can create. So if you could talk about that, that's the first part of it. And then the second part, if you can just select any 5 books that you think could provide empowering message, and list what these books are so that listeners can hear you. And if you want, you can also tell them what message or lesson you think each of these 5 books that you're suggesting can provide to a potential reader. And you don't have to limit it to 5 books, of course, you know. So why don't we go back to Professor Ngugi. Professor Ngugi, we can see you now. We don't know if you can see us, but we can see you.
I can see you. Let me see whether I can see you. What do I have? It says here, I launched the meeting, but I'm not launching the meeting.
Okay. But
what can I do to see you?
Well, we can see you and we can hear you definitely. So if you can survive without seeing us for the next 40 minutes.
Oh, you are the individual man. Okay, I'll try. Yeah. What was the question again?
Yes, the role of the artist, the role of the writer,
The artist has always been very important in African societies, as indeed in all societies. The artist is a maker of images, is a maker of images by which we look at ourselves, okay? And let me put this another way. Imagination is very important. In fact, it's crucial to our sense, our humanness.
Right.
We cannot create human societies without imagination. Mm-hmm. We cannot even think of housing without imagination, because we imagine the house in the head before we put it down.
Correct.
We use imagination to picture the future. We imagine the past. Even in religion, we use imagination to see God.
Correct.
Even, so imagination is very, very important. But just as the body needs food to nourish it, okay? And the soul, wherever it is located, need moral lessons or religion or that to feed it, the soul, with
Correct.
spirituality, if you like, What about imagination so crucial to our being? What nourishes the imagination? It is the art as a whole, writing, storytelling, dances, all the process of making images. They help to nourish our imagination. And with imagination, we can even imagine possibilities of a different society. We can imagine a different future and so on, okay? So the arts are crucial to our imagination. And that's why you find, by the way, in a dictatorship or authoritarianism, the first thing they go for are the arts.
Yes.
Writers, all those who work in images are the first to be attacked by an authoritarian regime because they are creating images of the possible, okay? So writers and artists in general are integral to our communities and what we can be. In fact, not just African, in all societies, even those who live in the caves, for instance, they used to draw pictures of the animals they were going to hunt and so on, right? They used to have dances, these are songs and so on. So the arts have always been an integral part of the evolution of the human societies, okay? And so the singer who sang during the liberation struggle is part of that community. The poet, the griot, who was part of that community. And the modern griot is surely the writer, the painter, the dancer, all those who work in images. They are very important to our communities. They're not external to, they are integral to our being.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of any books that you suggest to people that are listening now?
Yeah, I'd like to suggest, actually I suggest one book which I think is, and this is actually to do with my Mukoma Waguge. He's my son, and he's a professor of
at Cornell.
At Cornell, he's professor of English and something at Cornell. And the book I want to recommend is really the Nairobi Heat. And I recommend this book for one thing only, because it's the first novel I've seen, one of the few ones I've seen anyway. I think there are others who explore the relationship between African Americans and Africans on the continent.
Very good.
Because the power, we can harness the power of African American communities, the power of Caribbean communities, the power of African communities, the power of Pan-African communities.
Yes.
Yeah? There's nothing we cannot do in this world. We'll be the most powerful people in the world. We would no longer talk about whether Black Lives Matter, because we would make sure that they do matter, and anybody would know that they matter, and so on. So that relationship is very, very important, and that's why I particularly recommend that book. It's an attempt to explore that relationship. I like actually Ngozi, Chimamanda Ngozi's Half of a Yellow Sun.
Right.
Because of the magnitude of its imagination. And when you read it, you're going to look at Biafra thing very differently in terms of secession and so on.
Right.
But once again, in terms of the resources, in terms of power of the people, and so on. And so I would recommend that also very strongly. There's a new novel actually, which is made by what's her name again? She's from Zimbabwe. She teaches at University of California, I think Berkeley, and it's called The Old Drift, I think. The Old Drift. It's a big novel. The sheer magnitude of his imagination is really incredible. I would recommend that one, as well. There are still the old books. I think Sebene's book, God's Base of Wood,
right,
is still very, very important. Yeah. For one thing, that's one of the novels which again shows the collective power of women. That one I would really, if I had power to make people read the one book, well, or two books, to be Sebene's. Now, but there's another book which I think every African person, wherever they are, should read. This is the C.L.I. James's book, The Black Jacobins.
Yes, one of my favorite too.
It's absolutely crucial. I wish we'd read it over and over again. It should be a textbook in every class in Africa, whether it's in literature, in politics, in economics, and so on. Plus, James writes so well. It's a very, very important book. And of course, there's my old favorite, The Wretched of the Earth.
Okay.
Oh, God, that one. And I really now, in light of what we are talking about today, I'd like people to look at the last chapter again, when he talks about the destiny of the continent, whether we leave it to Europeans or we take it on ourselves, the destiny of the continent and African peoples and so on. Yeah. So I think that makes my 5 books, I think. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that.
Of course, there are many other very good books written by African people, young people as well, although I would still urge them and all others to really think seriously, and publishers as well, to really think about exploiting the possibilities of African languages. And for them to remember that French, English, Portuguese are not, I say again, they are not African languages. Yeah.
Okay. And Namwali Sorpel is the author.
Namwali Sorpel, yeah.
The Old Drift. Okay. All right. So in fact, I had the whole issue of Pan-Africanism as one of my questions. So I'm going to come back to that. I'm glad you brought it up. Before we get to that, maybe Sherry, you would like to take on the question of, the role of the artist, and then some of the books that you also suggest.
Absolutely, thank you.
And then Petna after you.
So before talking about the role of the artist as agent, I want to just say something about art and creativity and stick with the theme of hierarchies and pyramids that we have been discussing so far.
Yes, correct.
Emphasize that one of the another of the very lethal strategies of colonial logic is to make a hierarchy of knowledge forms, right? And what is real important knowledge as opposed to what is less important, what we could sort of live without. And of course, on that hierarchy is obviously the STEM fields are true objective knowledge, right? Because objectivity, hypothetical objectivity, is used as the metric of rigor, intellectual rigor. And then the opposite end of that spectrum is art and creativity and imagination. And so there's this idea already ingrained in the question about art that we have to unpack before talking about its true potentials, when it is not put as a part of a hierarchy in which it is deficient somehow. It is less true. It's decorative, it's important, it's nourishing, but it's somehow less true than real knowledge, right? So to me, I think of art and creativity as producing equally true truths as chemistry or biology or anything else, and often more true, but that's my own subjective opinion. But I think it's really important to really think about how we conceive of art and how we think about it in relation to other forms of knowledge, and then to really differentiate between art that is, articulating, making visible, making audible, making tangible these kinds of truths, or the sort of therapeutic healing things that we do for ourselves, and which is also important. But I'm hearing your question as really geared towards the former category of creativity as a way of really making. I'm going to say visible, not to overemphasize one sense over the others, but metaphorically making visible the possibilities and also the problems that we encounter. And
Absolutely.
so I would rather answer this question with an example than a hypothetical. And this just comes from my own experience working when I was doing my dissertation research many years ago. The question that I initially set out to research was about the relationship of politically engaged and more radical artists in fomenting like large scale social and political change, community based. And that was actually how I ended up working in Congo. I had done research with a number of other organizations in other parts of the continent, and I learned about this place called Yole Africa and went and started trying to investigate and found something that was truly extraordinary. Yole Africa is, of course, the cultural center that you mentioned before was founded by Betna. And the history of that, he founded it in 2000 in a moment where there was a lot of upheaval in the east of Congo. Obviously, that moment has been happening since 1884, and it's still happening. It was particularly escalated at that time, and in the midst of outright war and devastation, he came back from political exile and said, "We need to start a cultural center." And there was a lot of pushback. Like why is art the most important thing in the face of in an active war zone? And what he was able to build by bringing people together with a place to express and to participate creatively, to imagine other things, has been transformative, to the tune that Yole Africa still serves 17,000 young people every year free of charge, and it's over 20 years it's had a real sort of slow growing but significant impact at this community level, where people feel part of something that is compelling to them. They feel part of something that they identify by virtue of their aspirations instead of identifying by virtue of some sort of victim category, right? They identify as, I want to be a filmmaker, or I'm becoming a filmmaker, I'm a photographer, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, whatever it is, as opposed to the other model that is so prevalent in that part of Congo, which is the NGO model, where people are invited to participate in activities or get education in relation to experiences of victimhood. So there are project, initiatives for former child soldiers, and there are initiatives for victims of sexual violence. There are initiatives that are sort of meant to intervene, but the premise of them is that we're starting by asking people to identify in terms of the often most traumatic aspect of their lives. And what happens when we give people a space to identify in terms of their best understanding of themselves. And so watching what's happened at Yole Africa over the many years now that I've been working with the Cultural Center has given me a real appreciation for the role of an artist, not only at the level of creating works that circulate, that we can all access, and be inspired by, but also as people who work artistically within the community as a way of bringing beauty and ideas to a community. So I want to make that point in complement to everything that Professor Ngugi just said, because I think both of those manifestations of art are equally political and equally important. So that's what I have to say. And I'm not literature is not my area, although I love to read. And I think we just got a beautiful, beautiful list. Many of the things that I had jotted down here for my list of 5 books were just mentioned.
So
but
you're not nominating any books? You won't nominate any books?
Well, so what I would like, I can certainly echo the nominations. I would add again, I think that Something Torn and New is essential reading. That's one that I come back to all the time. Okay. Of course, The Wretched of the Earth, of course, Usman Simben. But I think perhaps where I could be more constructive in the resource department is to open up the list to include films as well.
Yes, please.
Because I think there's a lot of really wonderful learning that we can do, and inspiration and knowledge that we can gain through the rich history of cinema on the continent. And right. Politics aside, I have to say that the recent film that Petna produced called Matata is one such piece that I would strongly encourage people to watch, in part because not only is it an African story, but it's also a very conscious, very political manifestation of an aesthetic language. And in, I don't know, I don't want to preempt what you're going to say, but maybe if I can just say one thing.
I won't talk about it.
One of the philosophies, principles, I should say, that Petna works with in his work has everything to do with what Professor Ngugi has been saying. We have to speak in our own languages, and cinema as a language also has been inherited, and we've inherited a colonial cinematic language. And so Matata is one example of making a film in a language that is not a colonial language, but comes from a different place. I suspect you're going to talk about recoding.
Could you type that in the chat box for listeners?
I will figure out how to do that when he starts talking. Okay. But I would also then encourage, a deep dive into the more political films. Obviously, Ousmane Sembène, in addition to reading his writing, I think watching his work is really important.
Correct.
I suspect that you have other recommendations, and I've been talking long, so I'll maybe stop there and type some things into the chat. And let the artist himself speak.
Yeah. Well, I have an old slide in my face.
Thank you, Matata. There it is.
Yeah. The world is made out of stories, and people enact those stories.
Yes.
As creators, artists can be an artist who's telling story through painting, through poetry. Those are storytellers. For me, they're the one they influence the way we have to understand our own life and build it. On the books, I think I will more go in a way of like how certain people think. So it won't be one book in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me it will be like anything, any book or any reflection, any talk or lecture given by somebody like Felwine Sarr for today's generation of people who are really trying to reimagine the continent and see where the continent is going. I think Felwine Sarr is a person like every single African should read. And everybody who was thinking of liberation should read. Of course, most of the people I also had to say they have been already cited. And of course, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he was kind and he was so humble not to talk about himself. I think all his books, yes. I must read. And definitely the recent book that is not published, made by Cherie, which is talking about decomposing the colonial gaze. Right. I strongly recommend that. On films, and of course all the work also done by Yala Kisukili. She's a Congolese thinker who's supposed to be with us on this panel, in fact. I think all her work, all her research, it is a must follow as well. Now, if I can go on a film, that on the top of the list, all the films made by Ale Girema. I think they're very important to watch. Jonah Confra. Jonah Confra is a Ghanaian filmmaker based in UK. Of course, there are so many other work which I would love to recommend, but so far I think that's where.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going back to Professor Ngugi now. In the meantime, if you don't mind typing the suggestions in the chat box, so the listeners, in case they forgot, they can look it up and refer to the material. So we have.
Wrote it down already.
Oh, great. We have about 20 minutes left. So let's deal with the question of the Pan-African possibilities. For example, in the 1960s, Malcolm X realized the potential power of the Pan-African connection. And that is why he attended the Organization of African Unity meeting in 1964 in Cairo. And he met Nasser, he met Azikiwe, he met Lumumba, he met Nkrumah, he met Nyerere, he met Kenyatta, he met Obote. He made all these leaders because he was trying to get them to take the issue of the African-American oppression to the United Nations, to make it a human rights issue instead of limiting it to civil rights issue. And Malcolm would have been a very powerful spokesperson for the interest of Africa as well, had he not been assassinated, of course, in 1965. And personally, I believe that Malcolm was actually eliminated because he was making that connection with the continent, which the establishment saw as just too challenging and too powerful potentially. And obviously, in many cases, they find somebody else to be the trigger person. So that's the way I see it. But I bring this up to say that what were some of the missed possibilities when Malcolm was not allowed to solidify that connection? How can we revisit that connection today in the 21st century to allow, as Professor Ngugi did suggest, that we wouldn't have to bring up the issue of Black Lives Matter because we would make it effective? So we come back to you, Professor Ngugi.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, once again, sorry I cannot see you guys, but I can imagine you, which is even more powerful. Right. Let's first ask ourselves, why, there's a key question we can ask ourselves, although it's a rhetorical question. Why was Malcolm X assassinated? Why was Sankara assassinated? Why was Lumumba assassinated? Why was Nkrumah overthrown and driven literally to his death? What is common with all those? Yeah. So I think to me that seems a very, very important, a question to ask, ourselves, but there's a common thread in all of them. That is making African continent as the base for the liberation of all African peoples.
Correct.
Yeah. I think Marcus Garvey got it right when he talked about Africa for Africans at home and abroad. Okay. Yeah. Nkrumah was right when he talks about, Pan-Africanism, and all the others, we can list. They are really incredible thinkers who have always been at the forefront. So we have to imagine a continent of Africa, as a base for the liberation of all African peoples. This does not mean that African peoples in Caribbean or America give up their right to that continent. Remember, it's African labor that built modern America.
Correct.
It's African as commodities and as labor that built modern Europe, okay? So if you're in Europe as an African or in America, don't give up your right to being. What you find there was built by the power, the labor of African people, and so on. But nevertheless, we need our base, the continent, to be liberated economically, politically, and culturally. Remember this, Africa is the biggest continent in the world. Modern maps show that it contains the whole of North and South America, can fit into Africa. Europe is a little province in Africa, by the way, according to the new map, and it can contain much of China, for instance. So Africa literally can contain all the other continents. So you can see the implications of that in terms of resources, in terms of potentiality and so on. But we have allowed, either through our own weakness or whatever, or through conquest, for that power to be harnessed by other people.
Right.
So for me, the liberation of the continent as a base for the liberation of African peoples is very, very important. Just imagine if we controlled our gold and diamonds, copper and zinc and uranium and oil and so on the continent. If we're exchanging those on the basis of equal give and take,
yes,
where would we not be? But now those resources are taken to go and build factories in Europe and other places, as it was done with slave trade slavery, where our bodies as commodities were used to launch the so-called industrial revolutions in Europe and so on. It started with the manufacturing of chains for African bodies and so on, building ships for transport African bodies and so on, cotton and other things, right? So Africa has been used to launch modernity in Europe and America. It's time Africa started being developed for the benefit of African people at home and abroad, as Malcolm X used to say. Not Malcolm, Marcus Garvey.
Right.
And by the way, do you know that the mother of Malcolm X came from Grenada?
Yes, correct.
Louise, and she was a follower of Marcus Garvey.
Yes, she was.
So when we think of Malcolm X, actually, in a way, he got his politics from his mother,
correct.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Women again. Okay?
Yes, very well put.
Yeah.
Very well put. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. So Sherry, we can come back to you and Pedna, and you can touch on the issue of the Pan-African possibilities, but also use that opportunity at the same time to combine it with your closing comment, because 10 minutes really is not a lot of time. And if you can also add some other element, give us signs of hope in Africa. Because sometimes when we see our youth drowning to cross the Mediterranean, to seek the possibilities of better life in Europe, and that better life is working in kitchens and cleaning toilets, or working in those farms in southern Italy, literally as enslaved laborers, it really makes you wonder whether there is hope. So touch on any element within the limited time that we have left. Touch on the Pan-Africanism if you want, touch on the hope if you want, touch on anything, maybe about 2 minutes. We pass it back to Pedna for 2 minutes or so, and then we bring it up to Professor Ngugi also to wrap it up in 2 minutes. Thank you. I think you're on mute.
Who, me? No?
No, Sherry. Now we can hear you, Sherry.
We were trying to unmute and it wouldn't allow us to, so thank you. Thank you for that.
Yes.
So I have just a tiny piece to add to the excellent points already about Pan-African possibility. And here I'm drawing on the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she makes the beautiful point that capitalism requires inequity and racism enshrines it, right? That's a quote from her work. And that is, another way of just saying what it was that that Professor Ngugi was saying. And to me, we come full circle to this question of mental decolonization and our ability to understand that capitalism and racism, racial capitalism cannot continue to be perpetuated without inequality that has been enshrined in race. And when we try to solve political problems without also taking that into account, we don't get very far. And we have hundreds of years of evidence of this now that have built up in, at home and abroad, in the African diaspora and on the continent, of course. So I come back to the point of mental decolonization and really looking critically, learning how to see the systems that are around us that we are often unconsciously allegiant to at our own detriment. And then making other choices. And for me, that's also the piece of hope and optimism, is that education is a possibility and creativity is a possibility. And it is easy to be overwhelmed when we look at all of the pain and all of the statistics and the magnitude of the problem. And for me, the where I find hope are in the two activities that I named earlier, is looking not only farming myself, and we've started a freedom farm in North Carolina that brings together this Pan-African vision in a collective, now we're going to grow and control our own food sort of setting. So, and that's a part of a movement that is getting bigger and getting bigger. And so I look at that at farming as a very concrete way of moving forward. And the other piece, of course, is the reason that we teach the course called Decomposing the Colonial Gaze is because once we learn to see these systems, once we learn to understand, we have so much more agency to choose not to participate, and beyond choosing not to participate, to do something else instead. Because we often spend all of our energy trying to tear down a thing without thinking about what we're going to do afterwards, and we end up in the same cycle with different faces, in the positions of power.
Absolutely.
But to me, the real starting point is to be building something else instead, so that our effort is going towards constructing something that is not allegiant to racial capitalism and all of the other hierarchies that we have evoked in this conversation.
Okay, thank you. Pedna, in 2 minutes.
Yeah, well,
a few points and closing as well.
If I can borrow the phrase from Felwinsa when he talks about the ecology of knowledge. That is becoming now a trend where so many young folks on a continent where they are trying to appropriate themselves the other forms of knowledge, and respecting, giving it a space that there is space also for this other form of knowledge. I think that is it's already like a beginning, and in terms of hope, if we look at it in that way, I think there is no better time than this time ever. Like everything was predicted that it was a doom for the Africa is going down, and then the way Africa managed to deal with the COVID-19 just shows how that when Africans are close in their own spaces, they can bring miracles when there is no international interference. Yes. And when that was about to becoming a reality, everything was open, and then the international aid started coming in again. We have to start picking up those signs.
Yes, I like that.
We start picking up those signs and build on them. And this, I think, yes, thinking in terms of Pan-Africanism, those are the hope that we can dream of.
And obviously, we could go on all day with this conversation. We now come back to you, Professor Ngugi, if you can also in the remaining 2 minutes or so.
Yeah,
signs of hope.
Let me first of all ask a question. This is to Ghana and the leadership in Ghana. And the leadership in Ghana, obviously, they have, at the current leadership in Ghana, they seem to have quite positive on so many issues. So this question is to Ghana. Why is it that you keep on calling the international airport Kotoko Airport? And Kotoko is one of the British trained policemen who overthrew Kwame Nkrumah. Why don't you change that airport? Kwame Nkrumah International Airport. Why keep on keeping the image of the person who overthrew Nkrumah as an image you come to on entry to Ghana? Yeah, I'm asking that question to Ghana and to the leadership in Ghana to rectify that.
Thank you.
The other one, which I'm going to call for, not to Ghana, but to Africa as a whole, is something which is dear to my heart. All that to all of us should be. African languages. Colonialism started by criminalizing African languages. In fact, wherever colonialism reigned in the world, they criminalized the languages of the people they colonized. They used to beat us for speaking our languages in a school compound. They used to humiliate us in every possible way. Why is it in Africa today, African governments tolerate this criminalization of African languages in school compounds? Why do they accept it? That an African kid will be humiliated, will be beaten even for speaking an African language in a school compound. We really have to fight to stop this criminalization of African languages by African governments, okay? We don't have to wait for a Mzungu to come and liberate us about this. It's something which we can do, and we can call upon our governments to do that. And lastly, I want to really put appreciation for me to our musicians all over the continent, because in so many ways, our musicians, our singers, whether during the anti-colonial struggles or even to present musicians, on the whole, they are the ones who have kept our languages alive and relevant to the people. Just now, I've been looking at the YouTube for a song which is created in Zulu. I'm not sure about its message, but its rhythm is so powerful, called Jerusalem.
Right.
And it's being danced everywhere, all over the world.
Correct.
And this is done in Easy Zulu, the original composition, I believe is in Zulu, okay? So I want to thank and give appreciation to African musicians because they have always, nearly always kept faith with African languages. And
thank you so much.
Can follow, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ngugi. And we now come to the end of this very empowering program. And I think this can actually serve as a lesson plan that people can access and can share this widely throughout Africa. So I thank you, all of you, Professor Ngugi, Professor Sherin Daliko, and Brother Petnan Daliko for your participation and the empowering lessons that you offered for sisters and brothers in Africa and in diaspora today. Thank you so much. Stay well, and hopefully we will be able to do this again next year. Kwaherini.
Kwaheri.
Kwaheri. Yeah.